Collingwood have been unbelievable this last 12 months. Craig McRae's done a great job. Nearly got there. Would have been a better grand final if they were in there, but they 1 point. That'll be interesting to see. I mean, they've done well in the trade period, so it's been an exciting sort of part for those teams that are just trying to bolster their list and see how they go.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned Craig McRae. Did you think he'd be able to do so well, I guess, in his first 12 months at the club? I mean, obviously they came 17th under Bucks and looked like they were on the downhill slide in 2021, but Fly kind of came straight in and turned the place around.
He did, certainly in the way they played. They're very aggressive playing, come through the corridor, get it on, play it on, get it into one-on-ones. But it's pretty simple. He and Vossi both know the formula. I mean, the game hasn't changed that much. That even the game plan we use, depending on your forwards, that we used in the early 2000s where we won 3 flags. I mean, it works. But I think for Craig, I think for Collingwood with Grundy, for example, I think they thought Grundy probably hurt himself by not playing a lot of footy and being injured. Obviously, it's a lot of money when you're not playing. And I think Collingwood thought, well, we can get 2 good guys for the same price. So I think we're going to move him on. And in the end, he's probably the biggest name in the draft to sort of move. But yeah, just a poor season from his point of view really did seal his fate. But for Craig, he can get a couple of really talented players to fill some spots, which he's done, both in the midfield or defence. He's certainly looking to bolster his list, and that's what he's had to do this trade period.
Now, yeah, obviously, speaking about Grundy and the Pies, he signed that 7-year deal. I think it's around worth $1 million a season, so 7 years for $7 million at the end of 2019. Obviously, probably hasn't lived up to that expectation as we kind of knew him in 2018 and 2019. Was it kind of a poor mismanagement from the Pies signing that length of deal for that much money? Should they have potentially forecasted something like this to happen? Obviously, now that he's moved on to Melbourne, he's joining Max Gawn, which seems like a formidable duo. But do you think Collingwood probably should have, I guess, adjusted, maybe kind of recognised what could have happened back when they signed this deal? Or do you think they made the right move at the right time?
Well, I think it goes back to a couple of years ago when they clearly weren't running their club that well, because they ended up moving on Treloar and, of course, Stevenson. And, they lost a lot of talent then. And to keep Grundy was a bit of in the end, it would seem, and it shows that it was a poor decision to keep him on that list, on that money. Obviously, unfortunately, being injured. If he produced this year and they were making, he made the difference, or he certainly did the job that they expect of him, then I think it'd be a different story. But right now, I think for Melbourne to get him and have probably about 300 grand that Collingwood's going to pay is not a bad deal. Losing Jackson, Jackson, him and a couple of maturing players in Melbourne certainly got the Demons up to the top 4 again in 2 years in a row. Obviously, won the Flag Cup, last year. So they need it. But I think Jackson's a different type of player. He's a lot quicker around the ground. He's certainly not as good a kick, where Grundy kind of grinds away and he's a bit of a loper, where you've got Max Gawn, who can play a little bit of a backup role. But I think you'll find that if Grundy is anywhere near as injured, which I hope he's not, I hope he gets up there and plays his best footy. And Melbourne will, again, their biggest assets is their fleet of foot, small forwards, midfield, their defenders. Like, their defence is probably the best in the comp. So in the end, that's where it's got to be at. Melbourne will be up there again, no doubt.
Absolutely. Now, we spoke briefly that Grundy did sign a 7-year deal. Now, what's your opinion on these long-term contracts? We're seeing more and more of them each year. I know you were kind of not involved personally, but you saw Alistair Lynch sign a 10-year deal when he came from Fitzroy to Brisbane Lions. I think it was in the mid-90s. What's your kind of opinion on, I guess, long-term deals?
Well, generally they're great for the player. They can also backfire on the clubs. But if you look at, say, the longest deal outside of Lynch's deal, which was, $2 million or 2.5 over 10 years, you got the Lance Franklin deal. And when he said 9 years, I don't think anyone thought he'd actually finish that 9 years. Not only that, he's finished it this year and he's going it again. So you're playing a little bit of, I suppose, Russian roulette as to how far the player can play, what's his appetite to play for that long. In the end, for safety, I signed a 4-year deal in my career, which was good. It was really, really good to know where the next 4 years are, how much you're going to make, etc. So those deals tend to really benefit managers and players but they certainly are. I think they're probably a higher risk for the clubs than anything else. And in the end, Grundy's deal, well, that's a terrible deal in the end because you've got 7 years and a lot of money to pay out. When if you had gone a 2 or 3 year deal, which Grundy wouldn't have wanted because he's late in his career, that's really the problem. So in the end, to satisfy the player, but for Grundy's deal, that's definitely backfired on Collingwood. But then the Buddy deal has, except for a little bit of time he spent off, that's been a great deal.
Absolutely. Now, I just wanted to mention another big trade. Now, Jason Horne-Francis, he obviously was at North Melbourne for a year, number one draft pick, probably along with Nick Dacos, the best in his draft by some length. Played, I think, 15, 16 games for North, just looked visibly upset and frustrated at times. How do you kind of see that move? I mean, he couldn't really see out his contract. Obviously, the initial contract is 2 years for a player from the draft, and now he's moved to Port Adelaide. What's your take on that?
Well, I would have thought he's probably the first one we've ever seen who has got out of a deal. I don't even know how he did it after a year, because normally you're just locked in for those 2 years. Then you can re-go after that. It's very strange. Like North Melbourne have got a new coach in that period. There's lots of good things, obviously, barring the standing down of a couple of coaches from, in Chris Fagan and Alistair Clarkson from Hawthorn days, which, may produce something, may produce nothing. To go to Port, like for Port, it's wonderful, and for him to go back home, I think it's probably the most surprising of all the trades I've ever seen, considering that it's 1 year. He really should be there for 2 years. How bad are North going that your number one pick and the number one player out of the draft wants to leave after a year? It's not a good sign for North.
Now, in the same token, rewind the clock maybe 10, 15, 20 years, how would Lee Matthews have, and the Brisbane leadership group as well, how would they have responded to potentially, a player, not seeing out his contract, or a young player kind of going to an interstate club, obviously away from their family, away from their friends? How do you reckon they would have responded to, just say, I'm not sure, Simon Black after his first season requesting a trade, back home?
Well, I would have thought it comes down to your club culture. It's very rare that it would have happened. The only player I can remember it happening, but it was a few years into his career, was Desi Headland, number one pick in '99. It probably took him to 2002, at the end of 2002. So he still lasted 3 years. But the reason he went, his wife just said, "That's it, I'm out. I'm going back and I'm taking the kids." So for Desi, I spoke to Desi a couple of weeks ago at a reunion, and he said, what he should have done is wait 1 more year. He would have won 2 flags. It would have been a better situation. So it's really tough. And his whole family was moved over to Brisbane. So it's not like, these situations seem to be all pretty clear. But, sometimes the mother and father come over. They go from Adelaide to Melbourne. They're around their son. And then all of a sudden he wants to go back. There's more to it, I think. It's very rare. That's why I'm very surprised. And Shannon Grant, really, if it wasn't for him, he challenged the draft at the minimum wage. So after that, the AFL sort of upped the ante, and, they're well paid, they're doing what they should love. But to leave after a year, it's as bad I suppose, a reflection on North Melbourne as anything. And it really just never happens.
We've also spoken about Jackson and Horne-Francis. Now, Horne-Francis nominated Port Adelaide. Obviously there's 2 teams in Adelaide who have chosen the Crows. Obviously, he had that link to Port Adelaide. I think his old man used to play, and Jackson was largely known to always go to Fremantle over West Coast, although there was some talks. Do you think that players have probably too much power in their movement to rival clubs? And we've seen a lot of players in recent times, like Tanner Bruin. Obviously, he's from a country Victoria, so he's chosen Geelong, and Ollie Henry has chosen Geelong because he's kind of on that way. Do you think, players have too much power in that sense to kind of dictate where they want to be traded to, and then clubs have to officiate that? Or do you still think the ball's kind of in the clubs' hands?
No, it's certainly changed. So what happened was, in my era anyway, they changed just after that with free agency and stuff. Wherever they want to go, they must go. So the AFL would be legally, by the law actually in Australia. So there's a law that says you cannot tell someone where they can work, which means if they want to move somewhere, and the AFL had to really, fall in the line, because for a long time the clubs had the whip hand and said, well, we're not trading you. And then eventually the AFL know that if players take them to court, they won't win. any day of the week. So the restriction of trade, which is the law, says that you can move and go and work to where you want. So when players say, I want to move somewhere, barring the odd circumstances like Radicalier at Geelong wanted to leave, but he had a contract, and in the end that trade didn't work. But if he pushed it and he went and said, well, I got my lawyers involved and the AFL done the wrong thing, he would actually be able to leave and to go over and play at any club of his choice. And that's the joy of being a contractor, as we are. Yeah, everyone thinks they're employees. There's different rules around where you can work. So in the end, it had to happen. I mean, the players should always have to choose where they want to play and live and work. And that's the same in any job, in any field in Australia. So it's just the way it is. Clubs for a long time had too much say, too much power. And I think it's good that the AFL and the AFL Players Association has changed that so the players can get to where they want.
Players like Grundy and Horne-Francis, and we can talk about Bruin and Henry, but mainly we'll talk about Grundy and Horne-Francis. How do you think they'll fit in at their new homes? Obviously, Grundy and Gawn seems like a lethal combination, probably both nearing toward the end of their careers, but still obviously playing really good footy. You know, Max Gawn, 6 All-Australians, just in the last 7 years, and obviously Grundy can still get to that level. How do you think those two will function together?
Well, it's not really like a big change for, Grundy. I mean, Grundy will probably stay in the same house. He's just, Collingwood and Melbourne's grounds are like within, you can walk there. So it's not really going to be too much of a problem mentally to be in the same place. Moving into States is a big job. You've got to find your house. They've got lots of things to think about. But I think for him, there's no doubt going to a very good, solid, culturally strong club like Melbourne is no problem at all. I mean, he's a professional. A lot of guys at that level, it wouldn't worry him at all. It's just more fitting in, getting used to structures. There's always just different terminology. But he'd be more worried about his health, I think, than anything else. Making friends. He's probably got some mates, as you do in Melbourne. You've got mates at other clubs. You might even have a couple of mates that play there that he gets along with already. So, you might have mates you come through juniors with. You just never know. I don't think it's ever a big problem. When I moved clubs, I was 30, so I was late in my career, played 4 seasons at the Dogs, and it's not hard to get to know the players. You generally, know the ways and wherefores and what you need to do. It's more about you just fitting in, and that could take. The first year at the Bulldogs was tough. I didn't play. I played okay, but the next year I dominated. So, sometimes it just takes that 12 months, but they got plenty of time, and they are pros. So those guys, more the younger guys, like, with Horne-Francis going over there, he's still building his career. You generally take four years. So like when he's 22, he's going to be, a force anyway. So for the power to have him coming through with the year they've had, which was horrible at the start and really came home hard, good in the middle, you could see that both those guys, Jackson, except for Rory Lobb coming to the Bulldogs, who are a very strong side, they're going to the better side in those states at this stage. That doesn't mean that they are going to continue to be the better side versus, say, Adelaide and West Coast versus Freo and Port. But, those decisions are made because you want to win games, and Horne-Francis be hating losing.
Yeah, now was it playing the Lions for the first time? Do you recall, I guess, that first time, suiting up in a Bulldogs jersey, obviously in 2007. Did you play the Lions that year? You just mentioned that you were sick and potentially missed a few games through illness. Do you kind of recall that first time you played against the Lions? Was it frosty between teammates? Do you remember someone coming up to you, giving a bit of a nudge or cracking a joke, or was it kind of all business and everyone's a little bit serious once you cross the line and hit the field?
Oh, yeah, no, it was great because I knew all the players at that stage. So I think the first, we hardly lost to the Lions. They weren't a strong side as they were a few years before. But, yeah, we always had great battles against them. But because I knew all the players, like the psychology of the game, like I could tell everyone this is what he's going to do, this is how he's going to play, this is what strengths and weaknesses. We just had we had a better team anyway, but we had mentally, I think, the understanding of what we needed to do against that side where they were possibly going to get hold of us, and we just stopped them at every turn. And I think from that point of view, it was quite a joy. I remember, Robert Copeland, a guy called Ash McGrath would sort of palm me and tag me, and I played against those guys in practice all the time. So that was never a worry, but it was more, Nigel Lappin will tell you how much it makes him laugh. He said, you just got under my skin. You just got to, and to get Nigel stirred up is nearly impossible. But because I knew him so well and he just bit, and it was a bit of fun. We look back, we have a good laugh because that's something that Nige just wouldn't do, never. And he said that taught me a big lesson. After that, Nige, never got flustered again. But he was very experienced. He's a Hall of Famer, like superstar. So it was a bit of fun. It was good to win. We're always going to win most of those games anyway. But the crowd came and got booed, and it was all part of the theatre of sport.
That first 12 months at a new club can be difficult, regardless. I think you said you moved when you were 30. Talk me through maybe Jason Horne-Francis and his move to Port Adelaide. What advice would you give him? Obviously, a young, highly talented player, but now he's moving to a new club. His home state, but obviously, being around different people, probably people he hasn't met before. So we'll have to meet, a bunch of coaches, new players, and stuff like that. What advice, I guess, would you give him and also the other players who found new homes in 2023?
Well, when you go anywhere, I think it'd be like another start. Like he's just had a year, and not a great strong culture at the moment, North Melbourne. But then Port Adelaide have been quite successful in the last 5 or 6 years, so he'll go into that looking forward to learning off the older players. I think he's going to be a star midfielder. So anytime he can be around the ball, winning the ball, doing the things that he does best, I think they'll be a better team. Really, when you're young, you don't really care about anything except what you're doing, and your head down, your bum up. You're trying to get the respect of the older players. So I have no doubt that that's first and foremost. You just got to, pre-seasons are brutal. They're no fun. They're just hard. Lots of running, lots of just you're gassed all the time. It's just getting ready for the season. But for him, there's nothing else you can do. There's nothing else you can say except you got to work hard. You got to earn your spot, and you're in a better team. I think he'll notice that. And he'll notice the way the culture is, and that'll suit him because, you want to win games of footy. And Port Adelaide, I think, will start a lot better than they did this year, that's for sure.
Generally, there's winners and there's losers in trade period. Obviously, probably Richmond, Geelong, and Port Adelaide seem like they're winners. Obviously, they've attracted a lot of young talent, and especially, Richmond Hopper and Toronto from the Giants. Do you think those clubs are the only 3 winners? And do you have any, I guess, losers of the trade period in 2022?
Yeah, I think that the Richmond is certainly the biggest winners, but they've got to do that. Like they really can, like I said before, you couldn't do that in the mid 2000s. You just couldn't replenish your list so quick. You get 3 or 4 really good talented young kids in there or players in their prime, and you move a couple on, man, it just completely generates your list. I think probably the team that didn't do much, I mean, you talk about GWS, Gold Coast. I mean, they haven't really been able to attract talent. The Lions obviously were able to get Josh Dunkley, so there's a bit to like. Winners and losers, you always have to wait that extra 12 months to see who's won. But at this stage, if you're active, everything seems to be on track. I think the Bulldogs did well. I mean, surprise pack, it would have been Lockie Hunter. I thought he was pretty happy and settled there, but clearly not. So he's moved on to a fresher start. So yeah, it can only be gauged, I think, in 12 months, because players do go to new clubs and they do play well, and they will play well. They will play well next year. Not all of them will be like me and just be trying to find their feet again, and a bit of sickness here and there or injury. So there's going to be some stars come out that move clubs, and some players just can't get a game at some clubs. We had Craig Bolton, who's a superstar, went to Sydney, he couldn't get a game with us. Went to Sydney, became All-Australian, their captain, sent up back, like really good. So some players just need that. And 12 months from now, that was a great trade. That was not so good so far. That's they won a lot out of that. So yeah, Richmond for mine at the moment, but only time will tell.
Now, do you think the trade period is too long? Obviously, starting last Monday, probably the first couple of days was a bit busier. A lot of trades actually went through. Obviously, there's a lot of talking behind the scenes between the clubs and the player agents and whatnot. But do you think, and then obviously there was just a massive influx, late last night, I think 4 or 5 trades went through within the last 30 minutes. Now, do you think the trade period is just too long? Should they maybe limit it to maybe 5 days between a Monday and a Friday? Or do the AFL kind of like that theatre where, they've obviously put in an embargo yesterday, so no trades could go through before 3 p.m. on the last day of the trade period. And then you see a massive influx within the last 4.5 hours of trades. Do you think, the trade period is too long?
Oh, it's always too long. I mean, I think they used to have it at 3 weeks. That was way too long. So For mine, it's a bit like selling a house as I do every day up here. You know, it gets really busy early, then it sort of flattens off. And then if you've got an auction or you've got something where there's a deadline, they come and they have a flurry late. Even some of the deals that were done, I think there was one done at 7 p.m. that finished just before the end. Like, you don't need all those days in between. You could do it over 3 days, and everyone have to be organised and ready. I mean, they have enough time to get ready for trade periods. You know, max 4 days. You could just ring the clubs and say, okay, this is what we want to do. Let's work out a deal. Once they sit together, I mean, generally, they're getting smarter. Some clubs in the last few years have just absolutely stuffed it up. They've lost great players. It goes back nearly 10 years, you know, whether it was, you know, Luke Ball, these kind of guys, where they just sort of haven't come to an agreement because they've just been too, I suppose, stubborn or egotistical, where they pick them up in preseason drafts. Like that shouldn't happen. Star players should be able to move in the trade period, make it short, make it sharp, get it done. And, you know, the coaches probably like it a bit better. But, you know, you never know. The guys that do all the trading, the footy managers and the footy bosses, like, they probably love that period because that's when they're usually at their busiest, and that's where all the action happens outside of the draft, which the draft is not too complex, where you pick up young players. You generally have an order. Most people know who's the top 20. It's not that difficult. You can find a gem if you want, if you're lucky, but you've got to really be at the games and know your stuff. So, yeah, they could make it 3 days, 2 days. They could make it 1 day if they wanted, and it would all get done. The same amount of trades, the same everything, the same movement would always happen.
Are you still involved in footy these days? You mentioned real estate. Obviously, that take up a fair bit of your time, but are you still kind of involved in footy? Are you involved in footy programs? Are you coaching a footy club, or what? Yeah, I guess everyone. I want to know what's Jason Akermanis up to in 2022.
Yeah, I don't like to be involved in the clubs at all if I can, because you can't bet on the games, you see. That's very, very important. But I think mainly I just do ABC radio. I did this year. I haven't done media for a long time, so that was good fun. Just the Lions games, a few Suns games. I was going there anyway, so you might as well go there and call them and have a say about it. But I think for me, I can do a bit of one-on-one coaching, but I really don't have a lot of time. I mean, I play, you know, basketball a couple of times a week, play golf a couple of times a week, but I'm generally out doing real estate. But the last sort of 2 months, except for really the next 2 weekends, I've been away speaking and talking to clubs because the borders are open or playing games. So I think next year will be just as hectic, don't get me wrong, but it's just there's not enough time. And really, if you look at the AFL after COVID, like, they chopped the wages terribly and the staff. So it's very difficult to get a job in there. I've got a degree in coaching, but you know, you wouldn't want to go in there. The amount of time you spend there and the pay you get now is really unattractive. So that'll change in the next 5 or 6 years, I have no doubt, but I've got no interest. I've coached for years. It's not something, it's a shame I didn't sort of stay in it because I couldn't get a job in it, but it's all right. It doesn't worry me. Life has been pretty good once I finally got out of the AFL mindset. So yeah, it's kept me busy. I got a lot of side hustles, a lot of fun, but yeah, there's no way I have the time with 3 daughters to go into the AFL again.
Don't support the AFLW?
Unbelievable.